Good morning, Mr. Prime Minister. My name is Sydney Rossi, and I am a junior associate at an Indigenous-focused law firm at the University of Windsor. I want to say chimiigwech to you for providing me the opportunity to discuss our firm's proposal for a new Royal Proclamation 2021 Wampum Belt. The creation of a new Wampum Belt will be one step towards renewing the nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples across Canada. We believe our proposed Wampum Belt, which we have created using the overall theme of justice and reconciliation, highlights diversity and interconnectivity of Indigenous issues in Canada. We have identified 3 significant areas of justice to address in creating our Wampum Belt. They are environmental justice, transformative and restorative justice, and adopting the Indigenous legal orders of Pastamoan and Pastahowan in government policy and everyday life. With this, I'm proud to present to you our proposal for the Royal Proclamation 2021 Wampum Belt. We have used the traditional Wampum Belt symbols, the dish with one spoon, 2 individuals linking hands, and the 2-row wampum to renew our treaties of the past made between Indigenous communities and settler colonizers such as the British and French. We have also incorporated the modern scales of justice to reflect past and present justices and injustices, and to symbolize how balance may be restored in the future. Moreover, we have chosen to use the traditional wampum colors of purple and white to symbolize both conflict and peace, respectively. Indigenous history in Canada has been characterized by both friendship and violence throughout our history, and reflecting upon our past, we can learn to build a more inclusive and harmonious future with Indigenous peoples. With this, we'll begin our discussion on environmental justice in the dish with one spoon. Many Indigenous nations believe that the protection of the environment is critical to the continued survival of their communities and creation as a whole. This ties into the idea of environmental justice, meaning humans have a duty to care for the land, waters, and creatures of Turtle Island which sustain us. The Anishinaabe peoples believe that humans are obligated to treat all living things with respect, care, and thoughtfulness, and that all of creation is interconnected. Humans have a responsibility to be stewards of the land, to take only what they need from the environment, and abide by the Cree law of Osin and Win. This law prohibits transgressions against anything other than humans, including acts such as harming animals or polluting the land and waters. The environmental justice principles of respect, responsibility, and reciprocity to the environment are reflected in Osin and Win, as well as Indigenous teachings and creation stories. The environment is spiritually significant to Indigenous communities, as the lands and waters hold ancestral knowledge and are a source of identity for many Indigenous communities. To ensure transmission of this layered knowledge, the environment must be protected from threats such as overzealous resource extraction, clear-cutting of forests, and pollution of waterways. As Professor Tasha Beats mentioned in lecture on the importance of water to Indigenous communities, the lands and waters are a library for Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples alike. If we pay close attention to nature, the environment has many lessons to teach us that cannot be transmitted through Western models of science and research. To truly embody the principles of environmental justice, one must understand how the lands and waters of Turtle Island provide physical and spiritual sustenance to all humans. Further, the environment is a source of knowledge and identity for Indigenous peoples as well as non-Indigenous communities alike. Preserving the environment should be a priority for all, especially considering that climate change disasters, such as the recent floods in British Columbia, threaten the only lands and waters that we have now, and which future generations will seek to inherit. To represent environmental justice as part of a larger reconciliatory framework, we have included the dish with one spoon wampum to represent how we must all share Mother Earth's resources to survive, and that we all must be stewards of the creation that we share. Next, we'll discuss transformative and restorative justice and how it relates to our Wampum Belt. Transformative and restorative justice mean examining the Canadian legal landscape in its current form and enhancing it to better serve Indigenous communities. John Burroughs writes in his book, Canada's Indigenous Constitution, that Canada's pluralistic legal system is incomplete without the incorporation of Indigenous legal orders. Indigenous legal orders should be elevated to the same level of importance and significance as the civil and common law legal systems that have been adopted in Canada. To promote reconciliation in Canada, the Canadian justice system should integrate Indigenous participation into the construction of legal practices in Canada. This promotes decolonization, reconciliation, and the restoration of balance in Indigenous communities. The doctrine of discovery, which was used by European settlers to extinguish Indigenous rights and establish colonizer sovereignty over Turtle Island, is also still present in our legal systems today, even though the Supreme Court of Canada has ruled that terra nullius, meaning vacant land, has never applied in Canada, as Indigenous communities have lived here since time immemorial. The doctrine of discovery continues to subjugate Indigenous laws, traditions, and customs in Canada's legal system, as seen in circumstances where Indigenous communities have the onus of proving that territories in question, which belong to Indigenous communities, have been occupied by them since time immemorial, such as in cases such as Delgamu in British Columbia in 1997. Additionally, the institutions that form our criminal justice system, such as the RCMP and corrections frameworks, are steeped in colonialism and racism. The RCMP was originally used to surveil and suppress Indigenous peoples from resisting oppressive government regimes and provisions of the Indian Act, such as the pass system, prohibitions on gathering and practicing Indigenous customs as a group, and the creation of residential schools. Further, the RCMP today often do not act with urgency if a crime is committed against Indigenous peoples or persons, such as in the missing and murdered Indigenous women tragedy happening out in BC and Alberta along the Highway of Tears, as well as the case of Colton Boushie, whose body was left out in the rain after he was fatally shot by Gerald Stanley. Further, our current legal system establishes systemic barriers to Indigenous offenders, who are often disproportionately overclassed as high or medium risk in comparison to their non-Indigenous counterparts in the justice system. This overclassification of Indigenous offenders as medium or high risk results in Indigenous offenders being barred from accessing healing lodges, as these institutions only accept offenders classified as minimal risk. Indigenous communities highly value rehabilitation and reintegration into the community when Indigenous laws are broken by offenders. Systemic barriers to healing lodges for Indigenous offenders further marginalize Indigenous peoples and alienate them from personal healing and culture. To represent the need for transformation of the Canadian justice system, we have added the scales of justice, which incorporate Indigenous symbols into the base of the scale. This represents how justice should be inclusive, considerate, and representative of Indigenous lives and communities in Canada. Moreover, the beads of the scale are both purple and white. The purple beads represent the ongoing conflict within Canada's legal institutions and Canada's common law and civil law legal systems with Indigenous legal orders. However, the white beads symbolize peace and offer hope for the future wherein all three legal systems can be recognized as equally legitimate and work in harmony with one another. Restorative justice between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous Canadians is reflected on our wampum belt through the middle symbol of two people holding hands. This symbol reflects unity, peaceful coexistence, and interconnectedness, as well as support between the two communities as depicted in the Covenant Chain Wampum Belt from the Treaty of Niagara. To engage in comprehensive reconciliation, the Canadian government should abide by the Sacred Cree laws of Pastahawan and its subcategory Pastamoan when engaging with Indigenous communities. Pastahawan means committing a transgression against another human. Pastamoan is the verbal part of this law that guides how one speaks with other humans. Transgressions of Pastamoan include the failure to act or speak out when harm is done to another human or anything in creation. The laws are reflected in creation stories and teachings such as the Thanksgiving Address, the Teachings of the Longhouse, and the Code of Handsome Lake. Teachings also reflect living in harmony, community, respecting life, and gratitude for creation. Canada has broken these sacred Pastamoan and Pastahawan Cree laws through perpetrating violent policies such as residential schools and through the infringement of Indigenous rights as outlined in Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. The Canadian state has annexed Indigenous lands and resources through law and policy. thus demonstrating a lack of respect and creating an interruption of Indigenous knowledge, culture, language, and worldviews. Further, many of the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action have not been met, thus demonstrating a performative rather than substantive approach to Indigenous reconciliation efforts. To address some of these past wrongs and work towards mending the bonds of friendship and mutual respect with Indigenous peoples, Canada must begin to incorporate the laws of Pastamoan and Pastahowan into policy making and its legal systems and institutions to make an active, rather than performative, effort to engage Indigenous communities in reconciliation. In creating the new Royal Proclamation of 2021 Wampum Belt, the Government of Canada is symbolizing its priority to actively pursue truth and reconciliation, as well as justice, through an Indigenous lens. The creation of the new Royal Proclamation Wampum will be the first step in renewing the relationship with Indigenous peoples through mutual respect and the incorporation of Indigenous languages, cultures, laws, knowledge, and worldviews into Canadian legal, policing, and political institutions. To conclude, the traditional and modern symbols depicted in the proposed Wampum Belt reflect the goals of justice and reconciliation. We believe the dish with one spoon, the scales of justice, the people linking hands, and the two-row wampum are reflected of reconciliation, environmental justice, renewing the bonds of friendship between the Canadian government and Indigenous communities, and the integration of Indigenous legal orders into the Canadian legal system. Overall, the inclusion of a wampum belt with the theme of justice and reconciliation sets the tone for positive and active relations with Indigenous communities across Canada moving forward. This, I'll conclude my presentation. Chimigwech for listening, Mr. Prime Minister. I hope you have a restful self-isolation and have time to reflect upon what our firm has proposed here today. Thanks again, and all the best.